If you want to know more about Black British history and race relations, then this is the perfect video for you. Just a disclaimer, the word black in this video means those of African ancestry. Here I provide a list of Black British books in no particular order that I highly recommend you read to expand your knowledge. It's nice to watch YouTube videos about history, but use them to do some further reading on the full details. Welcome to Black British Hub, where I explore histories of the racialized peoples of Britain and the British Empire. Please don't forget to like and subscribe and keep notified. The first book I recommend is Black British History, New Perspectives, edited by award-winning history professor Hakeem Adi. Published in 2019, each chapter of this book is written by a different scholar and PhD researcher on various periods of the British timeline in chronological order. The book starts with an introduction written by Hakeem Adi, who talks about humans in the Stone Age. He mentions the 1903 discovery of Cheddarman, a human male skeleton who was found in Gough's Cave in Somerset, England, who is estimated to have lived in the 9th millennium BC in Britain. Cheddarman was a Mesolithic hunter-gatherer who belonged to the Western hunter-gatherer group. The Western hunter-gatherer group were dark to black-skinned with blue eyes, noting that the first people to live in what is called Britain today would have been categorized as black in modern terminology. Additionally, Adi mentions previous scholarship on the history of black people in Britain, criticizes the falsification of British history to only include white men of property, excluding women and everyone else who worked to produce that property for these rich white men. It's a mischaracterization to deem the history of this demographic as the only valid part of British history. Adi also writes about the general presence of African peoples throughout Britain's time period from the Roman times up until today. Following the introduction, there are 11 chapters, each chapter representing a historical account of a period, talking about medieval England, Georgian Britain, Victorian Britain, and the 20th and 21st centuries, not excluding the British Empire's role in affecting colonial subjects. The next book I recommend is Capitalism and Slavery by Eric Williams, who was the first president of Trinidad and Tobago. But before he would assume leadership, he was a historian and studied history in Oxford. There, he wrote his dissertation, which came to be known as this book, published in 1944. He originally wanted to name the book British Capitalism and Slavery, since the book heavily focuses on the British founding of the transatlantic slave trade, the rise and fall of its influence, and slavery as fundamentally being of an economic influence and for profits, racism being generated after that to keep up with the profits and convince people that black people were inferior. However, the reason he dropped British from his title was because capitalism is the same in any country. The book starts with the European so-called discovery of the Americas. Slavery being an economic benefit started with white people, or more accurately, involuntary servitude. However, many white people began to die with diseases and heat-related conditions because they were not used to the climate. The colonizers then enslaved indigenous peoples, but they were not satisfied as they felt that indigenous people were not built for hard labor. At the same time, they began erasing them. As this was happening, some British people travelled to the African continent. The physique of certain African peoples, as being of strong build, convinced them that they were the quote-unquote suitable people for slave labour. They also discovered natural resources that would finance their economies. This caused the British to begin their slave trade by kidnapping African people, particularly from the West Coast and also from Central African kingdoms located in modern-day Angola and the both Congos. Williams also talks about the areas that the British colonized and also the areas they lost, for example the United States of America, which marked the beginning of a decline in colonial influence, which would eventually make Britain abolish the slave trade in 1807 and abolish slavery in 1834. The third book I recommend is Black Resistance to British Policing by Adam Elliott Cooper. Published in 2021, Cooper writes about resistance and black liberation movements mainly in the 20th century and also some in the 21st century. He compares black resistance in the British mainland to colonial war, confronting a global system of racial classification, and talks about the forms of surveillance, including secret surveillance, violence and criminalization, where an immigrant heritage population are more likely to be met with police violence and criminalization than their white British counterparts. I was particularly shocked to find out about a 2010 scandal exposed by The Guardian, where there were 200 plus CCTV cameras in heavily populated Muslim areas in Birmingham that were used as a counter-terrorism initiative, a classic example of racist British policing. The public was not aware that 2 predominantly Muslim suburbs were monitored by a network of 169 automatic number plate recognition cameras, 3 times more than the entire city centres. Some of these cameras were secretly placed on the street, forming rings of steel, meaning that residents could not enter or leave their areas without their cars being tracked. Data was to be stored for 2 years. But I'll leave you to discover more things in this detailed book. The Lonely Londoners by Sam Selvon is the 4th book I recommend. Although this is a novel, it is semi-autobiographical, and the book is based on the race relations of Britain. Published in 1956, the Trinidadian author focuses on the life of West Indians and some Africans in post-World War II London. The novel is centered on Moses Alouetta, a Trinidadian who has lived in London for 6 years. He is about 10 years older than the boys who come to his place every Sunday. Most of the boys come from Trinidad and other Caribbean countries, although some come from Africa. Unlike Moses, most of them hope to be very successful one day in London. This novel explores themes of migration, internalized racism, sex, and isolation, and is written in a creolized English, which made this book groundbreaking. Initially, he wrote it in standard English, but abandoned it because he felt like he couldn't convey the true feelings, moods, and desires of his characters. Using creolized English in a third-person narration, he could reinvent London in its changing settings and bring his voiceless characters a place to live in it, according to Suchet Le Nasta's 2006 introduction of the novel. She added the novel represented a major step forward in the process of linguistic and cultural decolonization. Like I mentioned before, The Lonely Londoners is semi-autobiographical, as Selvon wrote it shortly after moving to London from Trinidad at age 7, staying in a hotel in South Kensington. In interviews, he said he had writer's block when writing in standard English, until he decided to change his mind about the language. The interesting narrative of the life of Olaudah Equiano, or Gustavus Vasa, the African, is an autobiography written by abolitionist Olaudah Equiano. Published in Movement and his own path to freedom through his Christian faith and through minor trade exchanges in which he was allowed to conduct, which allowed him to eventually buy his freedom. Equiano came from the Igbo village of Esaka, which was part of the Kingdom of Benin, but is now southern Nigeria, was kidnapped, sold to slave traders as a child, separated from his sister and shipped to Barbados with 244 other enslaved Africans. He was then sent to be sold in the colony of Virginia, British America. He was sold to Michael Henry Pascal, a Royal Navy lieutenant who renamed Equiano Gustavus Vasa. Later on, he took Equiano to London, where he learnt to read and write. It was during this time in 1759 where he converted to Christianity and was baptized at St. Margaret's Church in Westminster Abbey. He was just 12 years old at the time. However, in December 1762, he was sold to privateer Captain James Doran in Gravesend, Kent, and was transported to Montserrat. In Montserrat, he was sold to an American Quaker named Robert King, who taught him English fluently, guided him religiously, and allowed him to engage in small commerce, which saved him up to buy his freedom at the price of £40. When he was free, he felt it was unsafe to remain in the colonies and was actually almost kidnapped back into enslavement. He returned to England, where he became an abolitionist. His autobiography was successful, and he was seen as a speaking authority in the abolitionist movement. 8 British editions of the 2-volume book were published, as well as 1 American edition. War to Windrush, Black Woman in Britain, 1939 to 1948, by Stephen Bourne, is another book that I recommend. Published in 2018, Bourne explores the lives and experiences of Black British women from the beginning of World War II until the arrival of Empire Windrush boat in 1948. The book shows firsthand what life was like through photography and evocative prose. Now, I haven't personally read this book, but I think it's good to know the events from Black perspectives before the Windrush arrival. What's very important to note is that a lot of people from the colonies were sent to fight for Britain during the war, and that the Windrush arrival to Britain happened 2 weeks before the NHS was founded. The next one on this list is Blackamoors, Africans in Tudor England, Their Presence, Status and Origins by Onyeka Nubia, published in 2013. Now, the first time I actually heard of African presence in Tudor England was when a group from an organisation came to my school and talked about this. I had no idea there were Black people in Tudor England, as when I was taught about the era, it was about the ruling Tudors. Although I haven't read this book, there is a chapter in Black British History, New Perspectives, written by Nubia, where he writes about the Blackamoors. From written records, he is able to prove the presence of Africans in Tudor England. When Queen Mary I, who was also known as Bloody Mary, ruled, there was an African man who was a pioneer in the needle-making industry. An account written, Spanish needles were first taught in England by Elias Grouse Germain, about the 8th year of Queen Elizabeth, and in Queen Mary's time there was a Negro made fine Spanish needles in Cheapside, but would never teach his art to any. I imagine Nubia writes about more examples of Blackamoors, so it's best to give this book a read. African and Caribbean People in Britain, A History is the next book on my list and was written by Hakim Adi, published in 2022. This is a book that tells the story of Black people right from the start, from Cheddarman to the present. According to a review by Black Studies professor Kehinde Andrews, Hakim places Black people as protagonists, contributing to the growth of the nation and fighting for their rights. This tells us that it's not just about the mere presence of African and Caribbean people, but also about how these groups shaped Britain. In general, there is a tendency to reduce Black British history as if it started in 1948, following Windrush, but it's much more than that. Black Arsenal, edited by Matthew Harley and Clive Chijioke Nwonka, with contributions from Ian Wright, Paul Davis and more people, is a book that has just been released on August 29th, 2024, and I haven't read it yet. But if you are interested in football as well as Black history, then this is a book that might be right for you. According to the Voice newspaper, this book is a collection of essays and photographs documenting Arsenal's football club's contribution to Black British cultural identity. The news article adds, it sees the club's affinity with Black identity transcend football and spread across cultures, in the media, music, fashion, politics and everyday social experiences. Explored through a combination of stunning photography and rare archival images, Black Arsenal examines how a new Black iconography emerged at Arsenal at key moments in British history that became crucial to the creation of new forms of Black identification. There's plenty more books that I have missed, so comment below any interesting books revolving around Black British history that you have read or heard of. In the meantime, thank you for watching my video and I hope you've enjoyed it.